We think we can't know much about heaven. It's mysterious. It's all just about, floating clouds. And people will quote a verse in 1 Corinthians 2 that says, "Eye hasn't seen or ear heard or entered into the heart of man all the good that God has stored up for those who love Him." And they say, so you can't know what's going to happen. In the name of that song, you can only imagine. Now let me tell you for sure, you can only imagine because it's way beyond what we can comprehend. But the very next verse in context says, "But we have the mind of Christ." And actually the Bible is very clear about what heaven is, but I will tell you it's different than most of us think it is. Another misconception is that it's an otherworldliness. It's these disembodied spirits floating around, playing harps in eternity, sort of earning our wings. There's angels. Every movie, you can never see people's feet. There's always the fog machines going on, and there's floating clouds, and people are in white, and it's ethereal. And I don't know about you, but part of that sounds attractive for a half hour, or maybe 45 minutes, or I think worship pastors are going to love it. But if heaven, misconception number 3, is one very, very, very long church service, it might be really boring. I actually have read in a book where a pastor, a Bible-believing pastor, actually confided in another pastor, "You know what, if it's just one really long church service, I want to be with Jesus and I want my sins forgiven, but I'm not sure I just want to actually go to heaven." I've talked to people when they're young and we talk about the return of Christ or what would happen if you died. I've had people say, "I don't want Jesus to come back until I get married. I haven't even had sex yet." Or I've talked to an elderly couple who were 2 or 3, years away from this big moment and they're going to go to Hawaii. "I don't want Jesus to come back because we haven't even gone to Hawaii yet." In other words, we don't know what heaven's like, but it can't be better than married, sex, or Hawaii. I mean, that's kind of a limited view, don't you think? Those misconceptions then lead to some predictable results. One, we have a very temporal perspective instead of an eternal perspective. There's a reason why the church, the old word used to be worldly. We live for the now. The first 2 millennium of the church, heaven was a central topic. Teaching was paramount about heaven and hell and judgment and clarity and what it would be like. And in the last 100 years, as I'll share in a minute, there's been very little teaching on heaven, let alone the new heaven and the new earth. Second is, since we don't know what heaven's like, we don't study it much, we don't think about it much. I mean, when I meet people that have cancer, when I talk to people with debilitating diseases, when I go into third world countries where situations are very, very difficult, they actually think a lot about heaven. Most of us don't. Heaven holds very little hope or peace or that longing for home. You know that sense that for some of you that travel, and you've been on planes in different countries and, you finally get home and like you lay in your own bed for one night and you get up the next morning and go, "It is so good to be home." Multiply that infinitely. That's what heaven's going to be like. But most people, it doesn't create any longing or any hope. I gave this book, probably the most definitive work in recent years, Heaven by Randy Alcorn. But he literally read 140 books, all written within the last 200 years on heaven, then studied all the Bible, and then compilated it and put it together and came to the conclusion, I never heard any of this. That's the book I gave my dad. He read when he could it by himself for a while, and then he got where he really couldn't sit up and read very well. His wife, that was a pretty thick book, she read it out loud to him. And I'll never forget, it was a few months later, and I came back, and the days were getting really close, and we knew he wouldn't live long. And my dad went through horrendous times as a young man, and World War II, and some other issues, and he was paralyzed most of his life by fear. I don't know if any of you had kind of World War II dads, but I would remember every night my dad would get up, and he'd check all the locks in the house. 20 minutes later, he'd get up and check all the locks in the house. And you're thinking, like, they were locked the last time. But he had been through so much, he lived with overwhelming fear. And I remember a nurse came in and, he'd read this book on heaven and she was talking to him about, what they might do and could they extend his life and resuscitation. And I mean, he couldn't move his legs now. And he turned to her and said, "Lady, no matter what you do, don't use any extreme means. Don't resuscitate me."